Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on media, focusing on practical issues and news coverage. There are many different factors that can influence news coverage, including practical, organisational, technological and ideological factors that can impact on how the news is selected and presented. In this video, we're going to focus on the practical factors that impact on both the selection and presentation of news. Now, these are the logistical factors that influence the decisions to select a particular story for the news, both print and visual media. These practical factors can influence not only the selection of a story for news coverage, but also how the story is presented to the audience in a timely and comprehensive manner. There are several key practical factors to take into account when considering stories for news coverage, including cost, time, space, and the impact on the audience. In a competitive and saturated media landscape, the presentation of the news has to consider these factors in their coverage of events. One of the major practical issues impacting on the presentation of news is cost, and this is increasing as the world becomes more interconnected and the process of globalization means audiences are increasingly interested in events overseas. Many traditional forms of media, including print newspapers and television, are facing a decline in circulation and audience size as more and more news sources become available, and so often cost becomes a major factor in choosing whether or not to include a story in their news coverage. Williams suggests that, especially in print media, the increased costs of investigative journalism, matched with a declining readership, has led to a decline in quality of journalism as a result of cost-cutting exercises in big media groups. With the decline of independent news publications, often the cost of reporting on major events, particularly global ones, is only available to large media groups such as DMG or News International. Global news agencies often will report on major events, and their reports are then purchased and presented in smaller outlets in a pre-packaged format and without critical analysis. This has been called churnalism and has been a cost-effective solution for many news media sources, particularly those not part of global media groups. Even large news sources such as CNN, Sky News and the BBC will rely upon affiliate broadcasters in the nation where the event occurs for coverage, rather than dispatching their own correspondents to cover the event in an attempt to reduce costs. This explains why often the news we see is linked to nations where these global news networks operate, as reporting on events elsewhere can be cost prohibitive, unless there is a specific angle that impacts on the audience, for example the war on terror. A second practical consideration is the amount of time and/or space that can be allocated to a news story. With the growth of 24-hour news reporting in digital media, news stories break at a rapid pace and audience demand instant updates. This leads to far stricter deadlines for stories, and whilst this has been aided by improvements in information technology, does limit the geographical range of stories presented. Furthermore, with large amounts of news breaking, often stories are selected upon their simplicity, as more ambiguous stories with complex narratives are confusing for the audience and require longer on-air time or more space. This can also link to costs, as newspapers and even TV channels have to allocate time and/or space to advertisers to bring in revenue. In a 24-hour news cycle, the same stories may be repeated hourly or half-hourly, meaning that there are strict guidelines on how much time can be allocated to a single story. If a story is likely to run over several days, then this too will be a practical consideration, allocating time in the future to development of breaking stories. A third practical consideration is the extent to which news will impact on an audience. As the media landscape has changed, news needs to be accessible on demand to a broad audience and be able to be shared easily with others. As individuals have moved online for their news coverage, news editors need to be mindful of how they present the news in a way that can be accessed in a timely manner and repeated over different periods. As stories develop, more information is added, and digital formats are more accessible for this than print media. As a story breaks, initial reporting is followed up, for example with new developments, updates from those involved, reaction from the audience, and other commentators. This benefits 24-hour news reporting as it enables them to keep a story fresh within a news cycle, continually updating the story as it unfolds, and keeping the audience engaged. A final factor is the funding of the news. Media sources are reliant upon advertisers for revenue and therefore look to gain the largest possible audience to be able to charge more for advertising space. As news media competes for ratings in order to bring in this revenue from advertisers, it means it has to keep its coverage up to date, relevant, and above all, entertaining and informative for the audience. Franklin argues that in the late 20th century, news channels and newspapers begin to compete with other forms of news, what he termed infotainment, for the attention of audiences. This is more relevant in the digital age, as the growth of citizen journalism and increased media plurality mean not only more competition, but also being able to compete with alternative narratives that are put forward. For example, different views of political events such as Brexit or the global pandemic, which presented contrasting views of lockdowns and vaccinations. As a result, news agencies need to select stories that will bring in viewers and grow or maintain their audience. In evaluating the practical factors behind news coverage, it's important to consider the growth of competing ideas in the global media landscape. While costs have decreased for production, especially with the growth of new media, this also has an impact on revenues raised, as traditional sources of media lose viewers and readers to digital media sources. The Media Reform Coalition suggests that as many as 1 in 3 people use the internet exclusively to obtain their news information, and this has a massive impact on revenues raised for traditional forms of media. However, many traditional media sources have cut costs by going digital and rank amongst the most trusted sources of information being shared widely through social media sites. For example, the BBC News website is the most accessed source through social media. Conversely, the growth of the new media has led to accusations of fake news, particularly targeted at traditional sources that offer a specific version of events. And with so many sources of information available to individuals, this can have negative impacts on their ability to fund and provide high-quality journalism in a timely and entertaining way. That concludes this Tutor You Sociology topic video on media, looking at practical issues and news coverage. Thanks for watching.